Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Uncharted 4, A Thief's End for PlayStation 4. This is a third-person action-adventure game and the sequel to Uncharted 3 Drake's Deception. It was developed by Naughty Dog and published by Sony in May of 2016, and it has gone on to receive an absolutely massive amount of acclaim, like pretty much everything else Naughty Dog has released. Though if you've seen my reviews of the previous 3 Uncharted games, you would know that they are very much a mixed bag, where it's a lot of flash and not a huge amount of substance, although it was getting better as of course, Uncharted 2 and especially 3. So the real questions here become the following. First, how is this as a sequel to Uncharted 3? And more importantly, how is this as a capstone to the previous 3 Uncharted games? Well, let's go ahead and delve into this thing and find out. Well, let's go ahead and get the presentation out of the way. It is absolutely fantastic, just like all of the other Naughty Dog games we've looked at thus far. The texture quality is rather high, the post-processing effects are top-notch, the modeling and animation is fantastic, including of course excellent lip syncing, which really does help to make the characters come alive. But then on top of all of that, you have the absolutely stunning art direction of the environments. Now, the previous 3 games were pretty impressive in that regard, and especially considering the time they were made, but now that that's become a much more commonplace thing in AAA games, it's really impressive that they really managed to outdo themselves with the environmental design in this one. There are numerous moments where you'll be playing the game and you'll just want to stop and just take in the sights, because they have done such a good job with keeping up the attention to detail, not just on the micro scale, but on the macro scale as well. And really the only major issues I saw with the presentation are that occasionally the frame rate does dip a bit, and occasionally you'll run into a graphics glitch here and there, mostly things like physics-based objects glitching out a little bit, or things like the camera not necessarily being in the right spot, but those are not during actual cutscenes, they're only during the sort of in-game semi-cutscenes, where you still have full control. But other than that, there really wasn't much to complain about as far as visuals go for this thing. They really did a fantastic job with it, and even on the weapon reload animations, the things that have been plaguing them for a long time, they managed to come to kind of a happy middle ground on those. Sure, there's still a lot of reuse of the animations, but they are more correct animations for the various weapons that you're seeing, and you're seeing them actually modeled correctly as well, so that really does help. Plus, it seems like somebody finally taught the Naughty Dog animators how to reload AK pattern rifles and revolvers, so that really does help those look a lot better. But the high level of fidelity doesn't simply stop with the visuals, it actually extends to the sound design as well. Once again, they have absolutely phenomenal voice acting, where everyone voices their characters extremely well. There's plenty of humor and personality to it that really does give the game a ton of charm. Plus, they even managed to improve some of the sound effects. For example, guns and explosions sound beefier and more concussive, although they're still not quite as beefy as I'd really like. You don't get rattled around by the explosions very much, and the gunfire doesn't really have that definitive oomph to it that you'd really like out of it. But it is still an improvement over the previous Uncharted games, so they do deserve credit for that. Especially considering that it actually does echo appropriately in the various environments. So if, for example, you're in a canyon, it's going to echo a bit more than it is in, say, an open space. Some nice attention to detail there. But then there's the soundtrack, and once again, it's just like all of the other Uncharted games, which means that it's a good soundtrack that works very well in the confines of the game, but if you listen to it outside of the game, you're probably not going to be able to recognize it instantly as Uncharted music. I mean, let's put it this way. People kept telling me about, oh, you're missing out on the Uncharted theme. I didn't even recognize it until this game, because they actually tried to use it somewhat as a motif in this one. And then I actually went back and listened to it in the previous games, and I'm like, oh yeah, that tune has always been there. The problem is that it hasn't been used as a motif until now, so I haven't been able to recognize it as the Uncharted theme. But it seems like Naughty Dog finally learned their lesson with this one, and actually tried to do so, but it was kind of too little too late on that one. Because apart from that one track, which still does sound like a fairly generic action-adventure game track, it's really not recognizable outside of the confines of the game. Again, that does not make the music bad. I think people are really misunderstanding me on this one. It does not mean the music is bad. The music is good. It's just that, like in the previous games, you are not going to be able to listen to this outside of the confines of the game and instantly recognize it as Uncharted music. You'll probably instantly recognize it as action-adventure game music, but probably not from Uncharted. And you know what? It took 4 games, but at least finally I know what the Uncharted theme actually is. So they at least deserve credit for that, but beyond that, once again, Naughty Dog has done a fantastic job with the presentation in general. It's just that they really could do more with making the soundtrack stand out, and they could do more with the weapon and explosion sounds. But they are getting there, so that's good. But far more important than presentation could ever hope to be is the story and the gameplay. And the story in this is set after the events of Uncharted 3, where Elena and Nathan have actually gotten married and they've tried to settle down. Nathan's left the adventuring life behind and is instead working as an underwater salvager, but then he's visited by someone he thought was very long dead, and that was his brother. You see, it turns out that his older brother Sam Drake is not in fact dead. He's been in prison all this time, and it's only recently that he managed to get out of prison. And he comes to Nathan for help in finishing up their lifelong work, which is to find the lost treasure of the pirate Henry Avery. The thing is, Nathan left his adventuring life behind so he could be with Elena, the problem with that being that he's pretty much forced back into it by his brother, who says that he is in deep trouble with some very dangerous people, and if he doesn't find this treasure, then his head will basically be on a pike. So right off the bat, the stakes are pretty high, and they do make this a rather personal story for Nathan, so it feels like it actually has some impact on the character, as opposed to simply being, oh, well, he's looking for some lost city again. This means that unlike the first two games in the series, this is more like the third game, where it feels like the character actually has some stakes in what's going on, and he actually does sound like he's been working towards this for most of his life. Plus, it's an opportunity for him to go basically on one last adventure with his long-lost brother, and basically finish what they started so many years before. And unlike the previous game, where the story was really built around the set-piece moments, the set-piece moments are actually built into the story here. Unlike in Uncharted 3, where it feels like they did design the game around a few set-piece moments and then constructed a story around that, although they did manage to do a pretty decent job with it, admittedly. Here, it's more apparent that they wrote the story first and then said, okay, let's find out all these different set-piece moments that we can put into this and then make it work. The end result is a game that doesn't feel like it was made entirely for set-piece moments and doesn't feel like it was made entirely to be all flash and no substance, at least as far as the plot and its pacing goes. And while I don't want to spoil the story here for you, it does have a few twists and turns here and there, many of which are rather predictable, but others of which not so much, and it ends up working very well in the game's favor. And as the title says, it actually is a thief's end. It is the ending of Nathan Drake's storyline, so if they stick any more games in there that follow Nathan Drake, then that's actually going to be kind of annoying, because they've managed to conclude that storyline, even though there are other characters they can work with. And if Uncharted The Lost Legacy is any indication, then they are in fact done with Nathan Drake, and they are moving on to other characters in the franchise, and they have plenty of room to work with there. So if all goes well in the future, they'll stay far away from Nathan Drake because they've finished his storyline, and they'll move on to other characters in the Uncharted series who may have some more room for expansion. But here's the thing, most of the strength in the writing is not simply from the story, which actually is a pretty decent story this time around compared to all of the previous games where they were much more iffy in the storyline department. Here you're going on a hunt for pirate treasure, and everything does feel like it fits in very well in that regard, but that's not the real strength of the writing. The real strength is the characters and the character interactions. Because on its own, the plot is just okay. It fits in rather well with what they're going for and ends up tying everything together. But what really takes it a step beyond that is how much humor and charm there is with these characters. And that is a major mitigating factor for what ultimately becomes the big downfall of this game, which is, much like in the previous games, the gameplay. That is not to say that the gameplay in Uncharted 4 is bad. It is not a bad game by any stretch of the imagination. It's just average. Because what you have here is a rather basic third-person cover-based shooter where you stick into cover and then you lean out and you shoot at things, and obviously you're aiming for headshots so you can instantly down your enemies as opposed to wailing on them for a while. Certain enemies have more armor that you have to knock off than others, meaning that they are bullet spongy, although luckily the game is relatively sparing with those, so you can actually avoid fighting them for the most part, and even if they do throw those at you, normally you are equipped to handle them, so that does actually help out quite a lot compared to the previous games. And while the weapon handling is nothing particularly special, it is improved over the previous games, and it ends up bringing this thing up to a competent third-person shooter, as opposed to a bare-bones, messy weapon handling system like you had in the previous games. What they haven't really improved is the melee system. It's really not much changed over the previous game, but it actually is a bit weaker because you don't really have as many options with it. You see, in Uncharted 3, for example, you could grab an enemy, you could throw them into something, and then finish them off by grabbing something on the table and smacking them with it. Here, it's just the old hammer the square button system that you had in Uncharted 2, but faster and more responsive. Although they did add in the ability to do a grappling hook takedown, which is pretty amusing, so there is that. But beyond the changes to the melee system and the improvements they made to the third-person shooting, you're dealing with almost the exact same platforming system that you saw in the previous games, although now you have the ability to reach your arm out to grab onto things as opposed to simply having to jump from one thing to another. And they also introduced 2 new tools to the equation. First is the grappling hook, which you use to either swing onto things or pull things towards you or to climb up to a certain point. And the other tool you get is pretty late in the game, and that is a spike that you can use to dig your way into certain walls. It's pretty much the same functionality as the ice picks in the reboot of Tomb Raider and of course Rise of the Tomb Raider, where you use them as sort of an anchoring point for where you can jump off to another ledge. Unlike in those games, however, you can't use it to climb. You can only use it as an anchoring point and to dig your way into a wall after a particularly long jump, in which case you'll slide down a bit. But it is rather underused, being something that only applies to rock walls and only in the latter portions of the game, so it ends up being something that's a bit of a wasted gesture. But beyond that, there's really no major additions to the platforming system, and it is just as smooth and quick as it was in the previous games. It's just not really all that interesting. Luckily, the grappling hook does make things more dynamic and interesting, so they did at least do a good job with the grappling hook. But once you get past the combat and the platforming, all you have left are the puzzles, which are much like they were in the previous games, very simplistic, very easy, and the solutions are all given to you right in the game in the journal. Meaning that they're not very satisfying, but they do give a bit of a refreshing change of pace and do at least make you feel something like a treasure hunter, so there is that. And at least they're better than the complete waste of time that is the vehicle driving sections. There are a couple of sections of this throughout the game where you'll just be driving a vehicle around and you basically just end up going on glorified cutscenes in that regard. It's the kind of thing that is very conspicuous by its inclusion. You sit there and go, okay, well they obviously included this because they could, not because it actually adds anything. It's an artifact of the mindset of, with a new console generation comes new opportunities to expand. And unfortunately, they didn't really take that as expanding what they do well. Instead, they decided to just throw in a few segments where it doesn't really work that well. Now, the driving mechanics are certainly a lot better than, let's say, the original Uncharted, so that's for sure, but they're just not particularly good, and it really is not much more than a few set-piece moments here and there where you can look at a big open expanse. Or in the case of the action-oriented set pieces where you're just being chased by something and you're trying to get away, which is really no different from any of the other chase sequences except you're in a vehicle in that one. It's the kind of thing that doesn't really outstay its welcome, it's just that it becomes disappointing and frankly rather boring during those moments. But when you bring everything together, at least as far as the single player goes, it's a pretty decent game. It's actually better than the previous 3 games combined. That's only because you combine the rather solid characters and the decent enough plot with gameplay that is finally something actually decent. It's just not amazing. And that ends up propelling it into being better than its predecessors. But then there's the one thing I didn't get to cover in the previous games because I was looking at the Nathan Drake collection on PS4, which does not have the multiplayer components. So, how is the multiplayer in Uncharted 4? Well, it's split between 2 different modes. The first of them is the basic versus multiplayer, and the second one is the survival mode. I'll go ahead and start by getting the survival mode out of the way. It's just a basic horde mode where you fight against waves of enemies, you gradually can upgrade your weapons over time, you unlock new weapons by leveling up, and so on and so forth. You eventually get power-ups that you can use, and of course it is very basic, and frankly rather boring. Really, the only thing that Uncharted adds to the mix are the Uncharted mechanics, which means occasionally you can score a grappling hook takedown on an enemy, but that's pretty much it. Beyond that, it's just a standard horde mode, and there's really nothing all that interesting about it. But then you move over into multiplayer, and you notice something very quickly. This does have ranks in it, and thus you gradually level up over the time, you get access to relics, which is the in-game currency, and you gradually unlock things over time by using the various weapons that you already have. So for example, if you use pistols, then you unlock more pistols. If you use long arms, you unlock more long arms. problem is that many of the unlocks are straight up better than what you start with, meaning that people who've played the game longer just have objective advantages over people who haven't played it as long. That sort of thing is extremely tiring on its own, but on top of that they introduced DLC weapons that you can only get by either buying them with the premium currency directly, or by getting them in the various DLC gameplay item chests that you can get. That's right, this thing has loot boxes, and you have to pay an exorbitant amount of the in-game relic currency in order to get them. So it's one of those instances where technically you can get these items by playing the game long enough, but you have to play it for a ridiculous amount of time to grind out the currency you need to get it. And let me tell you, it is extremely irritating to be on the receiving end of someone who has managed to get one of those DLC weapons that is actually very powerful and just mows you down with it constantly. In fact, in all of the games I've played so far, I've noticed that all of the top scoring players have the DLC weapons. Now, I'm not sure if that's purely coincidence, or whether or not it is simply a matter of the DLC weapons just being straight up better than the ones that are in the base game, but I lean much more heavily towards the DLC weapons being overpowered than anything else. Not that it matters too much, the player base for this is relatively small these days, so you can still get into games, but they may not necessarily fill up, and more often than not you have somebody drop out of a game because they're doing poorly. This leads to team imbalances because you cannot change teams in the middle of the fight and you are just stuck with whatever. So if you're on the winning team and you want to take mercy on the enemy team and join over to them, well, you can't. And since there are so few people playing this, it's more likely that you're not going to get anybody actually joining in later on in the game in order to take those other people's spots. Meaning that I've actually had numerous instances where my team has been dominating or vice versa, and it turns out that there's only basically one or two people left on the enemy team. At that point, it just becomes downright depressing. But when you get down to it, the multiplayer itself really isn't even worth all the trouble anyway, because it's just a very standard multiplayer mode. The modes they have on offer are Team Deathmatch, King of the Hill, Domination, and Capture the Flag, and a couple of variants of those mixed in for good measure. And it seems like the game is designed around the King of the Hill mode because that was the only thing that was available in ranked play, and it's actually something that I could actually find players in. Believe it or not, I could find more players in King of the Hill than in Team Deathmatch. I'm not really sure why. Because ordinarily in most games, Team Deathmatch is the one that you're able to find the most players in, but I consistently had trouble actually getting into Team Deathmatch modes, so it's actually kind of interesting. I normally prefer objective-based modes anyway, so this is fine for me, but for people who are really into Team Deathmatch, then that's going to be a problem. But here's the thing, it all wears thin very quickly, and you very quickly realize that this is just a fairly mediocre multiplayer mode at its absolute best, and at its worst, it's downright horrible thanks to the unlock system and the cheapness on offer. Now, it's one thing if you run a private match with your buddies and you start just messing around with things and having some fun, but if you go online and you're expecting to get any sort of fair play, then, well, good luck with that. But of course, the Uncharted series has never been about its multiplayer. It's always been a single-player focused series right from the get-go. And throwing in a multiplayer mode like this really does scream that they did it just because they were told to. It feels really tacked on, and the ridiculous amount of DLC in it is downright insulting to your intelligence. And sure, you can get all of the unlocks by spending a ridiculous amount of the in-game currency that takes absolutely forever to earn, but that doesn't really change the fact that the game is almost pay to win. If it were only cosmetics, then I'd be fine with it, but since it does include gameplay items as well, that makes it pretty irritating. But ultimately, when you bring everything together, you bring the single player in with the multiplayer, and you have a package that ultimately ends up being better than its predecessors. It's still not an amazing game by any stretch of the imagination. I don't know where people got the idea that the Uncharted series was anything better than a really pretty but ultimately fairly average series at its absolute best. This is the only one in the series so far that I would say is even actually a good game. The previous ones were way too messy for that, but this one is competent enough in all of its regards that the writing really does manage to shine through, and actually does mitigate the fairly average gameplay mechanics quite a bit, which ultimately means that I give this a 3.5 out of 5. I still can only recommend it if you pick it up on sale, but this one I actually can recommend, which is something I couldn't really say for its predecessors unless you get them all in one bundled package like the Nathan Drake collection. Here, they finally have a game that actually stands on its own. Although honestly, without the previous 3 games to establish all of the characters and actually keep me interested in them, things might have turned out rather differently. Which of course brings up an interesting question. Do I recommend the first 3 games in the series if you're going to play Uncharted 4? Well, the only instances I could recommend actually picking up Uncharted 1 through 3 is if you did what I did and you picked up the Nathan Drake collection at a reduced price. If you get that at a reduced price, then you can play the first 3 games and have all the backstory for the 4th game. But that doesn't mean I recommend them as games. It means I deem them necessary to understand the main strengths of Uncharted 4, which is kind of a weird dependency, unfortunately. Thanks for watching.